Hey everyone, good to see you. People coming from everywhere, it looks like.
Mhm.
A lot of West Coast people too. All right, I think we are also live now on Facebook. Hi everyone, if you're joining us on Facebook, welcome. Sorry we're getting off to a little bit late start. We just had some technology issues. But I think we have a good group of people in attendance, so we're going to go ahead and start. So welcome to today's honest conversation, protecting children in foster care and adoption. My name is Tanyelle Gill. I am the Senior Director of Marketing and Development at Darkness to Light. If you have joined us before, then you're used to seeing our President and CEO, Caitlin Brewer, who typically moderates. Caitlin is with us today, but she's going to be a silent participant today. She's not feeling so well, so we're going to save her voice, and I am stepping in on her behalf. Really excited about the return of Honest Conversations. If you have not ever been to an honest conversation, what Honest Conversations is all about is just that, honest conversations, having deep and meaningful conversations about issues that we don't get to speak about a lot, issues that are highly stigmatized, but that we know are an important piece of this conversation that we have in child sexual abuse. And if you're not familiar with Darkness to Light, that's what we do. So Darkness to Light is a leading nonprofit in adult-focused child sexual abuse prevention. I want to thank all of the experts who are joining us today. We will do introductions in just a minute, but first, just a couple of housekeeping items. All the participants today are muted. So if you do have a question for our Q&A, which will be at about 10 minutes to the end of our conference, you can place that in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. You should see a Q&A feature. You can use the chat to engage one another, tell us where you're from, but please try not to put the questions in there. We just don't see them if you put it in the chat box. We do have a lot of questions that typically come through, and so we'll do our best to answer as many as we can, but we don't always get to all of them. So in advance, I apologize if we didn't get to your question, and we'll try to address those afterwards. Following this presentation later in the week, you will provide a copy. We are recording. And in addition to that, we will have this on our social media, our Facebook, our YouTube, and it'll be translated in Spanish as well for anyone who would like to view this conversation in Spanish. This is a safe space. Darkness to Light is really really committed to providing this safe space to be educational, informative, and inclusive. So I do want to say that we ask everyone to be really respectful of one another. Please refrain from using any inappropriate language. Be respectful of one another. If not, we may have to ask you to leave the conversation, and we don't want to have to do that. We know sexual abuse can be a difficult topic for many and can stir up different emotions. So if you need to talk to someone, please call our hotline 866-4-LIGHT or text LIGHT to 741 for free 24/7 confidential services from our trained crisis counselors. Okay, so today we have 3 leaders, not only in the field of foster care and adoption, but also with experience in trauma, attachment disorder, and child sexual abuse. Today, we're going to discuss the rates of child sexual abuse in children who are in foster care or adopted, as well as the unique challenges that those children and their families, whether it be adopted or foster families, face. And just to acknowledge that, you know, foster care is a great thing, and families open their hearts and homes to them. So starting with introduction, let's go around and do that. I've already introduced myself, so I will throw it to Barb.
Hi, my name is Barb Clark. I work at NACAC, which is known as the North American Council on Adoptable Children. We work around the US and Canada around the issues within adoption and foster and kinship care. And I am an experienced adoptive parent myself who specializes in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, but trauma responsive strategies and other things as well. And I live in Florida.
Excellent. Julie?
Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Beam. I'm the Executive Director of the Attachment and Trauma Network. We're a nonprofit that we're in our 27th year, originally a grassroots support and education effort for adoptive and foster and kinship families who were dealing with, in the beginning, we knew it as attachment disorders, and now we understand that all attachment disorders are trauma-based. So we deal a lot with trauma informing and helping families understand how to parent children of significant trauma. The other major program that we have in place is a program to trauma-inform schools and educators, and we have the largest annual conference for trauma-informing educators every February. And it's a great honor to be able to take the knowledge that we have gained over this last 2.5 decades into schools. And so that's a huge opportunity too. But our roots are very much in the adoption and foster field.
Thank you, Julie. And Wayne?
Yes, and I apologize to those who are participating. Technologically, I'm not savvy, and so you're going to have to just bear with me and hear my voice rather than see my handsome face. I'm Professor Emeritus from the School of Social Work. For years, I have been consultant to a number of public and private agencies in the area of foster care and adoption, with particular regard to helping foster and adoptive parents parent the sexually abused child. I'm also co-founder of Presidium, which is a risk management organization focused on minimizing the risk of children in residential and foster and in placement of children being sexually victimized.
Great. And Wayne, so my first question is for you, actually. When I was learning more about the rates of child sexual abuse in children who are in foster care and adoption, I was blown away. There were two statistics in particular, I think, that really stood out. And the first one was that as many as 80% of children in foster care have experienced sexual abuse of some kind. And the second was that the rate of substantiated cases of sexual abuse in foster care is more than 4 times higher than the rate in the general public. Those numbers are astounding. They're crazy. Why are these numbers so high?
Sad, so sad, but true. There have been a number of studies. One that I refer to was done some years ago here in the state of Texas in the Department of Protective Services. Hooper and Minshew found that 82% of the children in foster care at that time in Region 7, that's East Texas, 82% of them had had past histories of sexual abuse. They also found, and there are other studies to back that up, that the sexually abused child is the most likely child to disrupt in placement. That is, to move from one placement to another. Sadly, the identification of children being victims of sexual abuse is woefully low, and often, and it may not even be part of the child's record. It only comes out after the child has been in placement.
Wow. And what about children who live in a group home setting? Do we see that those rates for those children are even higher?
Oh, yes, even higher. Usually the projected journey is that after a number of placements in foster care break down and the child's sexually reactive behaviors become increased, that child may eventually end up in a residential treatment facility.
Do we see any peer-to-peer in that with a group home setting? That's something that in the prevention space we're looking at much more closely today, as we've seen an increase in the number of peer-to-peer cases of abuse.
Yes, we do, and yes, unfortunately we do, and that has to do with lack of proper supervision, lack of training of residential care staff. And unfortunately, we also see victim to staff victimization, which is unconscionable.
Yeah, definitely. Barb, I want to ask you a question that I think everybody is thinking, coming into a conversation like this, and that's, the fact, what makes children in foster care or children who are adopted more vulnerable to child sexual abuse? Why is it occurring at higher rates there?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, if a child is going into foster care, we know that that means that there is some type of challenges going on within their first family and the biological family. And so, sometimes that could be what is leading them into care. But what we also know about our kids who are in foster, adoptive, and kinship settings is that a lot of them end up having various forms of neurodiversities because of the trauma that they've experienced early in life. And for many of them, it's in utero trauma of alcohol or drug exposure and other traumas in utero. Many of them, it's just multiple layers of trauma that they experienced out of utero as well, which has a significant impact. We've got a lot of research showing impact on the brain and how the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, has shown us a lot about how that impacts children. But really what's happening is we have all of these kids who are very high functioning, have strong verbal expressive skills, but many of them are developmentally scattered. They're not at their developmental age. And part of the kind of brain damage or brain impact that they might have experienced from some of that early trauma, whether in utero or early in life, is in that prefrontal cortex where their executive functioning skills are. So they don't have great impulse control. They're very vulnerable. They don't understand abstract concepts. When we say, don't get into a car with a stranger, or it's not okay if somebody they're so abstract that they need incredibly concrete instructions. And so the more concrete we can always be on things, the better. But I think that's the biggest thing that we're missing is the kind of hidden disabilities that many of these kids are living with, because they have strong verbal expressive skills and fairly average IQs often. We miss the boat on that. And a lot of them are functioning closer to half of their chronological age. And so we're putting them in vulnerable situations that they're not developmentally mature enough for yet.
Yeah, and again, for anyone who missed that, ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it's something that has a direct tie to child sexual abuse, and the numbers are really staggering. And I think that this conversation that we're having with foster care and adoption is a really good example of how ACEs make children more vulnerable to sexual abuse.
Well, and there's various research papers out there that are trying to look at the numbers of kids that just have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder within foster and adoptive families. And, at minimum, it's probably about 50%, but it's almost always a misdiagnosis. The diagnosis is missed 86.5% of the time for kids who are in foster and adoptive families. So families are using strategies with these kids that are ineffective based on this hidden disability that many of them have. And kids with an FASD are 3 times more likely to be abused than neurotypical children. So there's a lot of factors that are playing into it that's super complex.
Yeah, that's really, I'm glad that you brought up missed opportunities for seeing these and diagnosing these, because that's so true. And it's something that we often forget about. Let me pose a question to you, Julie. What is something that we, organizations like Darkness to Light, the Attachment and Trauma Network, the North American Council on Adoptable Children, and others, what can we offer to foster parents and group home settings to help reduce these rates?
Well, we all can offer education, and the interesting thing about the organizations that you just named is that we all have a different component of that, right? You folks at Darkness to Light have the training on sexual abuse, the work that you do through your Stewards of Children program, those types of pieces of information that are really valuable to the adults who are working in in foster care and and adoption as you know, as workers. The folks at NACAC, we've partnered with them off and on for things for years. They definitely have the training of families, of workers in the adoption field, and the support of parents down. We have a lot of that as well, specifically around, you know, the neurology behind trauma, what happens to a child's developing brain, how attachment factors into that, both from an attachment disorder standpoint, which obviously were our roots, but even more importantly, how attachment and relationship and working on those skills are a buffer, a resiliency buffer for children, so that they can become more resilient. Because a lot of times what you see in a child that has been abused is that they didn't have a strong early connection to a primary caregiver. They didn't get the good enough parenting, as attachment theorists would say. And because of those things, they have an inner working model that, you know, that sets them up to, you know, to be in the wrong place and be victimized and all of those things. And then they don't have a way to deal with it. They hold it to themselves. They're not, you know, it's not a healthy emotional situation. They don't have an adult to turn to. And and this is so true for the foster and adoptive population in many, many ways. And unless their parents are prepared for that, it's, you know, speaking personally as a parent of both biological and adopted children, the difference is so vast. It's so vast. You have to understand what happened to them before they got to you, and how that really impacts who they are and what you can do to help put them on a more resilient path.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I want to say something about the organizations that work in this space. I've worked in nonprofit now for about 10 years in different nonprofits. And I'll tell you, this is an issue space where I can truly say there are no competitors. Everybody is working together so well. There's no competitors. We all want to work together for the safety of children, and that's shared knowledge, it's shared resources, and that is something in this issue space that is really refreshing, and I think is going to help us to really get to all of our shared goals to protect children.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we would love to work ourselves out of the job. I mean, I think everybody on here would say, you know, what happens if there are no more traumatized children? Well, yay, right? So yeah, we're all in it together.
Yeah, exactly. So cultural competency and identity play a huge role in the core beliefs of the North American Council of Adoptable Children. Barb, what can you tell us about the number of marginalized children in foster care and adoption? And you mentioned this a little bit already, but how does your organization try and help these children?
You know, what NACAC, what we firmly believe in is, you know, our first choice is always for children to be in their first family, in their biological family. And, you know, especially if we're talking about foster care situations, that's, you know, that's always the goal. That's federal legislation even. And so, you know, what we've been trying to do a lot at NACAC is, you know, Julie was mentioning this, we're into doing a lot of training for child welfare professionals, as well as the families and caregivers. And one of the things we've been trying to do really hard is focus a lot on giving those caregivers and the child welfare professionals the strategies of how to better support these kids so that they can be successful. Because using typical parenting strategies, typical consequence-based, punitive-based strategies, which is what the majority of the world uses, doesn't work very effectively for most kids that have trauma histories. And so, but what's happening, especially within foster care, is maybe we're finally getting that information out to the foster families, resource families, adoptive families, but we're not giving that to the biological family. So we might have a biological first family who's working their case plan, trying to get everything back, you know, getting everything together so that they can get their kids back. And then when their kids come back, if they're kids that have challenging behaviors and we haven't given them the parenting skills and these different strategies to use, it can lead the parents to become highly stressed again, to maybe end up cycling back into addiction if that was one of their issues. And that's why we keep seeing kids just cycling through in and out of the system into multiple placements. And so it's really crucial that even our child welfare professionals who are working with those first families are understanding that. We do have at NACAC, we have a training on November 9th coming up, an all-day training on trauma responsive strategies. And so that's something I would highly recommend that any professionals and family members try to attend if they can. But that, you know, we firmly believe that we want the kids to be able to go back to their first families. And if that isn't safe, that isn't always the right choice or the right option in each case. And if it's not, then definitely kinship is the next choice that we have seen through a lot of research is the second best option, right? In particular, it's really important that we are honoring the child's racial and cultural and ethnic and religious and upbringing and background that they have, so that we're not taking them out of communities and
That's so important.
families where they're comfortable and placing them in, you know, places that just are not the right fit.
Yeah. So speaking of placement, I imagine it's often not easy for foster families or adoptive families. So these instances of child sexual abuse in foster care and adoption, those are ones that we know about, but there are children who are adopted into families, and those families are unaware that sexual abuse has occurred.
Yep.
And we already talked about kind of the rates at which that exists.
Mhm.
So Julie, this is for you. How might this surface for a family after adoption?
Well, everything with children surfaces as behaviors in some way, shape, or form, right? That's the language that they have to communicate what's going on the inside of them. And we as parents, and this is where we all kind of get hung up if we are traditionally parenting children, we get hung up on the idea that we're supposed to control and manage behaviors and teach them how to have the right behaviors, right? Because it's we want them to go out in the world not having a behavior that is troubling, and at the same time we also feel a certain amount of shame from that, right? Because we're their parents, and this is a reflection on us and what a great job or a not so great job that we're doing. So instead of actually looking at what a behavior could mean, a lot of times we get really caught up with trying to extinguish that behavior, whatever it is, or do whatever that is. So at ATN, we're always talking to parents and teachers about going underneath. And the interesting thing, and especially in situations where whatever kind of abuse, but sexual abuse is one of the most significant impact, happens at an early age. Most adults don't think, most adults, when you pose the question, is it better for a child to have been abused early or late? They would say, well, early, because they can't remember it. But it's actually been proven in studies over and over again that that is exactly the opposite. That what happens to you early on, when you don't have the language to explain what's happening, and you don't have, especially if you don't have that healthy attachment and that bond to a trusted caregiver, if that's not a really secure situation for you, your entire what the scientists call an inner working model, how you feel about yourself and the place that you see yourself in the world is significantly altered. So your behaviors can be big. They can be all the things that you learn in trauma. They can be a fight behavior. They can be a flight behavior. They can be a freeze, clear down to full out dissociation. They may not have anything that would make the adult go, oh, well, this was sexual abuse, or they may be very overt, behaviors along those lines, but they're troubling, and they're things that are not stopped by traditional behavior modification tactics. And so parents are often very much, by the time they are seeking out support and help, are very frustrated, very overwhelmed, very scared, very angry. by the time they get to this situation.
Yeah, and that's really why it's so critical that we engage prevention early on in a child's life. And so, Wayne, I want to give you the opportunity to jump in here. You know, what if you can talk a little bit more about what are some of the warning signs that adoptive or foster children, you know, that the warning signs that they've been sexually abused, and what should those caregivers do if they notice them?
Well, I truly believe that the families are the true healers of our children who have been traumatized and victimized. I do want to go back to something that was said a while ago about reunification. I think when we get to sexual abuse, the question of reunification with the child's birth family is even more, how should I say, more troubling. Why? Because a decision is made, did the sexual abuse occurred or not? And all too frequently, the family sides with the perpetrator versus the child. And so when we're talking about reunification of back to the, yes, it would be great. But when it comes to sexual abuse, oftentimes the family has surrounded the perpetrator into denial, and reunification is not a viable option. Now, back to your question, I think caregivers, foster and adoptive parents, need clear guidelines about how to keep, and concrete guidelines on how to keep children safe. And children, well, for many children, a way of attachment is sexualized. And this freaks the caregivers, really freaks them out. And so I'm a firm believer that on the onset, whether the parents, whether we know whether the child has been sexually abused or not, I'm a firm believer that at the onset of placement, that each family negotiate with the child a family concrete safety plan about what's okay and what is not okay, and clearly laid out about touch contract. How do we touch in this family? How do we share? How do we show that we care for one another in a non-sexual way? In this, for concretely, in this family, we do not touch one another's genitals. In this, how can I touch you in a way that is safe for you? How can I give you a good night kiss or put you to bed that will not frighten you? These are concrete discussions that need to go on from the get-go of placement.
Yeah. Barb, do you agree with what Wayne just said? Are there other ways, additional ways that families can prepare to bring a child into their home who have been sexually abused? Because, you know, like he said, it's not always, unification is not always a viable option.
Yeah, no, absolutely it's not. And you are definitely right on that, Wayne, that in cases of sexual abuse, that's when it is much more tricky and more complicated for sure. Yeah, I mean, what Wayne is saying is exactly what we try to coach and work with families and professionals to help families to do. We've got the concreteness has to be there, right? There's so much abstract in our world. And so many of our kids that have trauma histories just don't do well with abstract things. So the more concrete we can be, the better. We also really need extremely high levels of supervision. And that's something that has to be talked about up front when we're placing kids in these families. And we have to, and we have to make that really clear as the professionals who are supporting these families of, you know, about that, even just amongst the siblings, right? We just know that there can be that possibility of the kids offending with each other in the home, or, you know, acting out. And to be honest, we can see that definitely can happen. Not all kids who have been sexually abused do end up being perpetrating those things, but some of them do. And then also, unfortunately, some of our kids who have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, even if they didn't experience sexual abuse, are very sexually impulsive, because that's part of their brain damage. The brain injury that they receive is their impulse control. it's hard. I mean, imagine being a 15-year-old boy or girl with the hormones of a 15-year-old boy or girl, the internet and all that's out there, but yet having a developmental scattered profile where your emotional maturity is maybe 3 or 4, even though your language skills, your expressive language is that of a 15 or even a 17-year-old. So it's this recipe for a disaster. And so too often we're placing kids in families and then sometimes in our larger families in particular is where we see a likelihood of that stuff to happen. So we really just have to be very diligent about the fact of if there's impulse control issues for the children, that we need extremely high levels of supervision. But we also just have to make things concrete, and exactly what Wayne was saying, like a touch contract even. And I've done things even where we draw out like an outline of the child's body, and then we color in the pictures, like here's, red, nobody touches the genitals, you draw a bikini, like here's the no touch, that's red, nobody touch, you've got to just figure out visual ways of making things concrete, and understanding that also the social skills are lacking, right? And technology can be an incredibly challenging dynamic for these families to navigate with these kids once they're getting into adolescence. If they have a tendency to gravitate towards that, I will say my 23-year-old daughter who has an FASD has been sexually predated. There has been sexual predators all over on her. Anytime she gets on an electronic device without supervision, she's immediately contacting hundreds, within a 24-hour period, hundreds of men from around the world on various dating apps and social media things. And when I sit and get that device and go through it, there is no doubt in my mind that, I think 10% is conservative, them are probably sex traffickers, who are trying to. So it's just, there's so many complexities, and we've got to talk about these things. We've got to give the families the right tools of how to have those conversations with their kids, how to keep devices safe, or how to know when a child is developmentally mature enough to handle a certain type of device and all of that kind of stuff, because it's scary.
Yeah, absolutely. And the world is changing, and it's hard to keep up sometimes with all of these changes and new technology. And children are being introduced online in schools for the first time, that they never were in the past. And so it's definitely difficult.
And nothing is one and done. I have to say that too. Like, when my parents, I think this was even unusual back in, when I grew up, but I think they had the sex talk with me once and they were uncomfortable then and didn't want to talk about it again. Right. And so no parent likes talking about sex or sexual abuse or anything around sex with their kids. And so it can't just be we're going to talk about this when you first come into our family or when you were just placed here, or it's not something you have to talk about daily, but it needs to happen on a fairly regular basis. And we've got to get comfortable with that.
Yeah, definitely. I question, are there any parents out there who haven't had uncomfortable parenting moments? The answer is probably no. And, we have to acknowledge that these conversations are uncomfortable. That's what this programming in particular is about, honest conversations, but we still need to have them. Julie, at Darkness to Light, we've always been committed to being trauma informed, and I think in the last year in particular, we've made great strides in weaving that into everything that we do. And it's just so important with dealing with survivors of child sexual abuse to be trauma informed. How can foster and adoptive parents create a trauma sensitive or trauma informed home? What does that look like, sound like, feel like?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, because we do we have a very specific framework that we guide parents through to do that. But as I was listening to others talk, the one thing that I do want to point out is that parents really need to know whatever has happened previously to their child. there's a lot of times we don't know that sexual abuse is in their background. Sometimes because record keeping isn't, and that information doesn't get passed. Sometimes because, it was like never disclosed for whatever reasons. Sometimes the children came from international adoption or in a kinship situation where that information was not available. So, parents being trained and being on the lookout for those pieces of information are really helpful. And then the systems around them being as transparent as possible, and then being as supportive as possible with that information. From a standpoint of what does it look like to be a trauma-informed parent, at ATN, we believe that it looks like being a therapeutic parent, not being a therapist, but looking at parenting as a healing mission, as a way to provide a relationship and help a child learn to regulate themselves in a way that they can then access more healing, build more resilience. And I know that sounds like a lot of words if you don't know what all of that means, because it all has to be unpacked. The first step, of course, is always safety. So Wayne's safety plan from a sexual abuse standpoint is so right on. And we talk about all kinds of safety, that everybody in the family not only has to be safe, but they have to feel safe. And that means everybody, right? So including the parents, because sometimes children's big behaviors are dangerous and there has to be a plan around that. And so then from that safety, establishing that safety is the baseline, basically. And then from there, it's about building that connection and relationship. It's about having a very structured yet nurturing approach. It's not that I'm going to be an authoritarian parent or I'm going to be more permissive. It's being highly nurturing and highly structured all at the same time, so that you can, because the boundaries help create the safety, and yet the nurturing is what is needed to help build the connection and the relationship. And then knowing enough about neuroscience to understand and look for signs of when your child is about to dysregulate, help them, figure out how to get to a more calming place. And that by itself is an entire deep dive in how you would help another person co-regulate. When I had biological children, the shocker to me when we had our adopted child was that I had to actively learn how to do that. And I kept thinking, I didn't teach that to the older three. Like, why didn't I have to teach this to them? But I did teach it in their infant year by what I did over and over again of meeting their needs. And I taught it to them prenatally by the things that I did to keep my health, and all of the things that sometimes children don't get. And that's why they end up in foster and adoptive situations. So there's a lot there that parents have to learn. It's why I think foster and adoptive parents are in a league above a lot of other folks, because of what they need to learn to be really good at it, and the hearts that they usually have. I think they're some of the best folks on the planet, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I might jump in here, I want to, if we're thinking about this through a trauma resolution perspective, there are lots of things, there may be a lot of things, many things in the environment that are triggers for a traumatic event that regarding the sexual abuse that most parents are not aware of. For example, like in a safety plan, an item that I have in one of the items that I have in my safety plan is that if I go into another person's bedroom, the door must be open, or I must have permission to go into another person's bedroom. I will dress appropriately around the house. And so for the family that is unaware of sexual abuse and the dynamics of it, they may be inadvertently presenting the child with a lot of triggers that were part of the traumatic sexual abuse in the child's original birth family.
Yeah, definitely. And our, parents play a role in that too. And I have to laugh because in my house, we have the rule for my son that there's no doors closed. When his friends are over and they're in the room, there's no closed doors. And he called me out on it just yesterday.
Excellent.
I was there with a friend and we had my door closed in the bedroom. I was showing her a Christmas gift I bought for the kids. And he said, Mommy, we don't close doors in our house. And I said, you're right, honey, you're right. So that's great. Barb, I want to point out that we've gotten a lot of comments about the unicorn floating in your pool. And
I missed that.
that's, part of maybe being trauma informed is it's very soothing to those watching to see your pool and that unicorn.
There you
So
go. You're
thanks
welcome.
for that special placement there. All right, Barb, I know that we've talked about this, weaved it into this conversation, but it's so important because this is really what this is about. What supports and resources are available to foster and adoptive parents once they bring children into their homes, specifically if they know that the child has been sexually abused?
Yeah. So, hopefully every state should have a variety of support groups that are out there for parents and post-adoption, post-placement support networks. You can always go to our NACAC.org website, and I think you hit find support or something like that, and you go to your state. We also have Canadian ones listed as well. And we can find who provides post-adoption, post-placement support in your local areas. But to be honest, some states have much more kind of, bulked up good post-adoption supports. Not all states are equal in that realm. But there also are a lot of virtual options too, right? Facebook has a lot of support groups. Like I had just searched this, there's actually a Facebook support group that's called Support Group for Parents of Sexually Abused Children. And so, and those, as much as I have a love-hate thing with social media because it has caused so much, so many safety issues for my one child in particular, but that's an amazing way to get some pretty quick, immediate support is by connecting with other parents. And that's what I would say, even if in your local area or the local areas where anybody is working, if there isn't like a strong support group program going on, first of all, reach out. That's one of my main jobs at NACAC is to do training for, counties, states, territories, provinces, tribes to train parents to lead support groups. And that's what we've really found is so powerful is that if a parent, an experienced caregiver can be the one that's leading the support for other parents, it's really powerful. And sometimes they can, partner with a professional to do it, but it's, we've found that that's a more effective model. And so if you're not able to find it in your local community, you can email me, Barb Clark at nacic.org, and I can try to see if we can help get some training or get some people experience there. But I would say, get connected on social media too. There's the other thing too, with our kids who have experienced sexual abuse or any other kind of abuse. I know I've seen this going through the chat box and we've mentioned it, TBRI, trust-based relational interventions, therapeutic parenting, connected relational parenting is really what our families should be doing. And it's what all of our professionals within the system should be trying to, also educate the families to use. And even in group homes or residential treatment centers, that's the type of approaches that should be used, right? So it's, Heather Forbes Beyond Consequences stuff. It's, reading books like Wounded Children Healing Homes by Jane Schooler and several other people. Dr. Mona Delahook's books, Beyond Behaviors and Brain Parenting and that kind of stuff. And again, on, November 9th, we're going to have a seminar on those kind of strategies too at NACAC. But really, it's trying to help parents to figure out how to more effectively support and nurture these children as they're trying to heal from their past traumas.
Yeah, and I'll tell everybody, we have a whole list of resources provided by our panelists. So we will share those out with the recap, with the video of this session, along with the contact information for our panelists. So there's tons of support out there. I do want to do a plug-in for Darkness to Light's brand Child Safety Pledge. Child Safety Pledge is a hub for parents looking for support and resources and tools, not just in child sexual abuse, but in child safety in general, a lot of poly-victimization, online safety, things that we know have a direct tie to child sexual abuse. So please check that out at childsafetypledge.org. Take the pledge and you'll start receiving a lot of these resources and things that we have to offer that are geared towards parents, busy parents, and parents with children at different developmental ages and with different needs in different communities. So we do have to get to our Q&A, but I just want to wrap up our session with asking all of our panelists, what is one thing you want to leave with parents or advocates about this issue and how to prevent it? So maybe Julie, you can go first.
Somehow I knew I was going to get to go first, and I thought, oh, I don't think I have an answer for this. on the prevent issue, to re-prevent it in your home, I think safety is the key, and having an active safety plan, understanding that it has occurred and that likely the behaviors will manifest themselves, and then having a safety plan that your family agrees on.
Great. Wayne?
I would just say ditto to that. Safety is a prerequisite for recovery. And without a sense of safety, a child is stuck on pause or an easy victim a person who can be easily re-victimized. So I guess the takeaway from all of this is, how do we create an environment that is safe for all those, for the child, for the foster family, the adoptive family, etc. Because without safety, progress will not be made.
Definitely. Barb?
Yeah, safety with supervision, and then also never losing sight of hope. Our kids can always heal, and I think it was Wayne that said it earlier, and Julie probably did too, but relationships and connection is, I think that's one of Bruce Perry's quotes, right? The best way to heal from trauma is through relationships. And so, and then just not losing hope, because there can be some pretty harsh behaviors that our kids that have significant experience with abuse can exhibit in their homes. And so to try to give the families the support and the hope to not give up and to keep working through it, because these kids are worth it.
True.
Oh.
Absolutely.
And speaking of relationships, that leads us to a good segue into our first Q&A question. And any of you can jump in on these questions. The first question here is, what role do peers play in helping foster children heal from sexual abuse, whether it is other foster children or adopted children? And I think that's a great question. It's something I didn't think about, is the other children that are in the homes with them, whether they're adopted siblings or other foster children. Are the strategies the same? Are they similar to just, creating safe, nurturing environments?
I think a lot of it is about modeling, and for, our kids that have experienced abuse to be around other children, other siblings, other peers their age who are modeling, age appropriate behaviors and social skills and, fun and that kind of stuff. So I think that's a piece of it.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. And I think it depends on where the child is developmentally as to how much that the peers are going to, or they're, in a lot of cases, their siblings who will probably their first peers that may be able to help them learn what it means to be in a family. Because a lot of times they're coming from a situation where there has been abuse and neglect, and they truly don't understand what that looks like, what it looks like to be in a family, and how a family cares for each other and interacts, and all the things that look like they're coming natural from biological families sometimes.
To me, it's the adoptive or foster parents. Parents are the architects of the family. And some years ago, I co-authored with Sherry Anderson from NACAC, beyond sexual abuse, the power of healing of families. And I think it's primarily, for me, it's the parents.
Agree.
Mhm. Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yep. And you also have to be careful too, because we also have to honor the privacy of a child. So it's not like the siblings should, likely don't need to know their entire story of what, I mean, and we have to, like Julie was saying, look at the developmental age and that kind of stuff. But it's never the job of the peers or the other siblings or things like that.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
shouldn't be an intentional thing that we put on them.
That's a
Right.
great
And a lot
point.
of times when you have children that are adopted or moved, which I am 100% behind, moved into foster care as a family group, those older siblings will be more parentified. And that means that they're not going to be as playful. And, like there's so much they don't get to experience in life because they've tried to take care of their siblings. And so in a lot of cases, the parents have to, as Wayne put it, they have to orchestrate that, those roles to switch, if you will, for those children. And, there's a complexity there that happens. And a lot of times, and this is hard for a lot of our parents, we talk to them about, keeping the child's world small, and the child may come to you as a 10-year-old, but developmentally is more like 4 or 5. And so even those peer interactions are not, that's not what you need to focus on. There are so many other things that need to be focused on in the family unit than even what a typical 10-year-old would do, because they're just not ready for that yet. So they can get into that whole situation where they are being victimized or misled in some way by peers because they don't understand what's going on.
Sure. Yep, that makes sense. So here's another question. The foster care system often gets a bad rap, when in reality, foster families are doing so much to help children. So in your opinion, does the foster care system add to the trauma of children who've experienced child sexual abuse? If that's the case, what is it that's broken in the foster care system? Or if that's not the case, what is it that's working and can address those issues?
That's that's a loaded question.
I was waiting to see if you were going to take that one, Barb.
We only have 3 minutes, so.
I do not want to touch that question with a 10-foot pole.
I will. I'll do it. I think sometimes they get a really bad rap because most folks that go into this field are dedicated and they want to do the right thing. There's not enough money, period, ever enough money in this field for what really needs to be done, because trauma leaves such a wake of destruction in these children's lives. The flip side to say, what I know about attachment is that every time a child is removed from their primary caregiver, there's a wound every time.
Yes.
It may not be a big one. It may not be like an earth-shattering, unrecoverable wound, but it is a wound. And so every time that a child moves from a foster placement to another foster placement to another foster placement because of their behaviors, because of their trauma, we are doing them more harm. Yep. And we have to figure out how to build a system that's going to minimize that.
And this is why I didn't want to touch this question, is the fact that the foster care system is broken. And it's broken because of our culture and in terms of the value we put upon children and the lives of children and the importance of nurturing children. And the reality is that in our culture, children are expensive. In our culture, it costs money to take care of children. And in our culture, children are not valued. And if someone can figure out a way that we can value children in a culture, then I think the foster care system would be in better standing.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I agree with that, Wayne. I also think our whole world has to wake up to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, because I think it's what's leading to a lot of kids going into foster care. Quite often their biological parents likely had an FASD that was undiagnosed. And it's leading to a lot of the chaos in our society right now. And so I think within child welfare, we've got to open up more to that.
Definitely. So that I want to leave us with this final question, and I'm happy to jump in on it. What is the government doing, or what can they do to address abuse in systems that are deeply rooted in government support and funding? And I will tell you, the government's not doing enough. And so one of the things that movements that exists out there is called the Keep Kids Safe movement. It's a collection of organizations dedicated to child protection and an end to child sexual abuse. They have created the U.S. National Blueprint to End Sexual Violence Against Children and Adolescents. And I recommend everyone to go there, keep-kids-safe.org, check out the work that they're doing. But that is what they're trying to do, is to hold our federal government accountable for child safety, provide mandates, funding, all of the things that we need to be able to better protect kids from sexual abuse, no matter where they are. We are out of time. That was such a great talk. So I just want to thank you all for taking the time and volunteering your time to be here with us today. This was a great jump back into our honest conversations. And this is not where the conversation ends. I want to point out, we know that we need to have more of this conversation and others. We need to continue engaging diverse panelists and survivors with lived experience, and we're going to do that. We have slotted to do some of these more parent-generated discussions on Child Safety Pledge. That's childsafetypledge.org, and Darkness to Light is going to continue to host these honest conversations at least every other month, so that we can continue shedding light on these topics. So thank you all for joining us. Keep a lookout on your email for a recording of this session available in English and Spanish. And everybody, keep up the great work that you're doing and your journeys in prevention. And we're here to support you in any way that you need.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks.
Thank you. And I apologize for bearing with me on my technical ineptitude.
That's okay. The audio is great. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.